This is Garis Masculist MGTOW flyers, that is 2 3-page essays on the themes of masculism and MGTOW, written by and read aloud by Prof. Dr. Hugo de Garis. This is flyer number 294, entitled The Masculist Freikorps Option. Description. This flyer states that the masculists have the Freikorps option. That is, that when push really comes to shove, that is, when the population really starts to crash, due indirectly to the hated feminazis having taken over the divorce courts and making them toxic for men, resulting in 2/3 of young men refusing to marry, refusing to have kids, the critical point, and spending their money on themselves, then masculist soldiers will go on a sex war into the streets like the German Freikorps just after the end of World War I, and shoot the hated feminazi bitches to stop them from indirectly wiping out whole populations, and then forcing the menfairing of the divorce courts and the menfairing of the gender laws, bringing in the para, etc. The flyer itself. The Masculist Freikorps Option by Prof. Dr. Hugo de Garis. Email profhugodegaris@yahoo.com. Website profhugodegaris.wordpress.com. The Freikorps was the German volunteer army who took to the streets in armoured cars and machine guns just after the end of World War I and shot the Jewish communists who were threatening to take over the German government. The Freikorps murdered the Jewish communist intellectual leaders Liebknecht and Rosa Luxemburg to prevent the Jewish communists from taking over Germany the way they had taken over Russia in 1917, and then went on to commit the worst Holocaust in history, murdering 66 million white Christian Russians, says the highly respected Solzhenitsyn, who made Stalin's gulags infamous in his book The Gulag Archipelago. Solzhenitsyn had a contact in the Russian Statistics Office who told him that the Russian Jewish communists had killed 66 million people. Solzhenitsyn won a Nobel Prize for Literature. He wrote 2 books about the Jews in Russia, one called Die Juden in der Sowjetunion and the other 200 Jahre zusammen, which is 200 years together, which talk about the Jewish takeover or putsch of Russia, and then the Jewish mass murder of 66 million white Christian Russians, the greatest Holocaust in history. It was not committed on the Jews, but was committed by the Jews, namely Jewish Russian communists. Thus the Russian Revolution was not Russian, it was Jewish, a Jewish putsch, a Jewish seizure of power. Lenin was a quarter or half Jewish. Trotsky was Jewish. Jewish name, Lev Bronstein. Stalin was Jewish. His family name in Georgian meant son of a Jew. The Germans hated the takeover of German society by the Jews in the 1920s and did not tolerate the idea that the Jews might take over the German government the way they had done in Russia. So the Freikorps put its foot down and saved Germany from a fate similar to what happened to Russia, the victim of the worst Holocaust in history. By analogy, the masculists will not tolerate that the hated feminazis, the fluffy feminist hypocrites, the amoral, child-minded, 10% smaller-brained femalians indirectly wipe out whole populations due to their takeover of the divorce courts, making them so toxic for men that young men refuse to marry, refuse to have kids, which is the critical point, and spend their money on themselves. The hated feminazis have indirectly become genociders who have to be stopped. Responsible-minded masculists, that is, masculist soldiers, will not tolerate that these feminazis are wiping out whole populations, so will stop them by, in the limit, going out into the streets the way the Freikorps did and just shooting these feminazi bitches so that humanity does not get wiped out. When human communities have their very survival threatened, they will resort to desperate measures. That is, they go to war. They fight their enemies who threaten their very existence by killing them. A similar logic applies to masculist soldiers who will not tolerate that the feminazis take over our society and indirectly wipe it out by a continuance of the toxicity of the divorce courts, so that young men continue to reject marriage and paternity, that is, continue to be MGTOWs, men going their own way. The current state of affairs cannot continue, because if it does, then whole populations get wiped out in a mere century. Young men under 35 in the US, Japan, Germany, etc. refuse to marry, refuse to have kids, and hence will directly wipe out their populations within a century. Do the math. A century is 4 generations. Each generation reproduces only a third of its number. So over a century, that is a third of a third of a third of a third, that is about 1%, so that the other 99% dies off and is not replaced, thus destroying the population. This situation is intolerable to the masculist soldiers, who look upon the amorality of the fluffy feminist hypocrites who have taken over the divorce courts, not giving a shit for the welfare of the quarter of married fathers that they financially massacre and whose lives they destroy. These child-minded women, these hated fluffy feminist hypocrites who want equal rights with men but reject equal moral obligations with men, namely bothering to pull their financial weight by bothering to get a career-competent education at high school and college, to become a FIP, financially independent person, as an adult, and not parasite off the money of a man. Many of these divorcing fluffy feminist bitches actually hold divorce parties to celebrate their masochistic destruction of the lives of their ex-husbands, which is the main reason why they have become so hated by the masculists. If things continue as they are now, then in time the population will fall and people will become alarmed. The media will finally wake up that a disaster is in the making and that something must be done to stop the population crash. It is at this moment that the masculists will tell society that the root cause of the problem is due to the takeover of the divorce courts by the hated fluffy feminist hypocrites, and that they have to be stopped because indirectly they have become genociders, wiping out whole populations. The masculists will warn society that if the feminazis are not stopped, if measures are not taken to stop them, then the masculist soldiers will go on a sex war against them, against the gender politicians who make the men unfair gender laws. For example, the divorce laws that are so gender unjust against men, who reject the paternity rejection right, etc., and against the feminazi divorce court judges and lawyers, murdering thousands of them in a veritable sex war for the sake of the preservation of the populations whose survival the masculist soldiers are ensuring. Of course, this is an extreme measure, but all wars are extreme, when people kill each other en masse, usually fighting for their survival. The feminazis are now so hated by the masculists that increasingly masculists are talking war talk, threatening that if men aren't given gender justice, then feminazis will be murdered in large numbers, that is, in a sex war against feminazis, against feminazi gender politicians, and against feminazi divorce court judges and lawyers. Society has not yet woken up to the idea that whole populations are now being wiped out due to the toxicity of the divorce courts, due to their takeover by the hated feminazis, the hated fluffy feminist hypocrites. It's likely, however, before the masculists exercise their Freikorps Option by initiating a sex war, that less extreme measures will first be tried to destroy the feminazis. The most obvious and most benign method is to intellectually destroy the feminazis with a verbally aggressive attack on the very core ideas of the feminazis, discrediting them with masculist scientifically based attacks, discrediting feminazi ideas so that the general public no longer accepts them. The masculists need to put such enormous moral pressure against the feminazis that feminism is destroyed, that young women fear to state publicly that they are feminists, because if they're stupid enough to do that, they will pay a very heavy price. They will be ostracized, totally ignored by men, left to rot on the shelf, manless, loveless, sexless, babyless, poor, and spat at for being a feminazi, the most despised kind of female whom society utterly rejects. We masculists will of course start with an intellectual rejection of feminism and put enormous moral pressure on society to destroy feminism, accusing the hated feminazis of being indirect genociders who have to be stopped. But at the end of the day, if the gender laws are not menfaired, and if the power is not brought in, if the divorce courts continue to massacre men financially and destroy their lives so that young men continue to reject marriage and paternity, then ultimately the masculists will take up the Freikorps option to ensure the survival of our populations by going out into the streets and shooting the feminazis, the gender politicians and the divorce court judges and lawyers. The masculist soldiers will initiate a sex war so that humanity survives. We masculists will not tolerate the amoral, irresponsible, child-minded mentality of the hated feminazis, the hated fluffy feminist hypocrites. In the limit, when populations really start to crash, we masculists will use the Freikorps option and simply shoot these feminazi vermin. Cheers. Prof. Dr. Hugo de Garis. Email profhugodegaris@yahoo.com. Website profhugodegaris.wordpress.com. YouTube channels De Garis Masculist MGTOW Flyers and De Garis Essays. Patreon patreon.com/profhugodegaris. minds.com/profhugodegaris. BitChute bitchute.com/channel/profhugodegaris. Ciao.